Let the record reflect we are back in the presence of our jury this morning. We're back on the record in State versus Mitcham. Let the record also reflect that we are in the presence of counsel for the state, counsel for the defense, and Mr. Mitcham. Good morning to all of you. Welcome back this morning. As you may recall, we went through those preliminary instructions last week, and today we will turn to opening statements this morning. As a reminder, the parties are permitted to make opening statements, and what they say in their opening statements is not evidence. It's simply an outline of what the parties think the evidence will be and is offered to help you understand and follow the evidence during the trial. And with that, I will turn it over to the state whenever you're ready.
Good morning. It has been said that the home serves as more than just a physical space. It is a sanctuary where individuals seek solace, comfort, security away from the outside world, and the freedom to let their guard down. For Allison Feldman, her home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood in Scottsdale, was just that, until the evening of February 17th, 2015. You see, that was the night when Ian Mitcham, a man unknown to Allison, made his way into her home and proceeded to violently beat, sexually assault, and strangle her to death. Sadly, on February 17th, 2015, Allison's sanctuary ultimately became the place where she would take her very last breath. This is Allison Feldman, and back in February of 2015, when she was killed, she was 31 years old. Allison wasn't originally from Arizona. In fact, she had spent most of her formative years in Minnesota. While there, she lived with her two parents and her older sister. Allison was tremendously close with her family. After Allison graduated high school, she moved to Arizona, specifically Tucson, so that she could attend college at the University of Arizona. After she graduated college, she eventually moved to Scottsdale, bought herself a condo, and then a short time after that began her career in medical device sales, a career where she experienced great success. Allison was independent. She was hardworking. She was well-liked by others. She spoke to her parents every day. She didn't live a fast life. She wasn't a partier or a gambler. She didn't use drugs, and she only drank socially on occasion. Around April of 2014, Allison met a man named Alex on a dating website, and they went on their first date April 4th, 2014, and their relationship progressed steadily from there. By June of 2014, Allison and Alex were in an exclusive relationship. Around that same time, Allison had decided to sell her condo, and then she purchased and moved into the house of her dreams in a neighborhood near Old Town Scottsdale. At the time, Alex was living with a roommate in Tempe, but he would frequently spend anywhere from 2 to 4 nights a week with Allison at her home. Allison was happy in her relationship with Alex. She loved him. And as for Alex, well, he felt the exact same way about Allison. In fact, he believed she was the woman he wanted to marry, and he had plans on proposing to her in July of 2015. Unfortunately, happily ever after, for Allison and Alex would never come. Now, before I talk to you about what happened to Allison on February 17th, it's important that you understand how she spent her last few days. Fortunately, she was able to spend time with two people who meant a great deal to her. As you can see from the calendar, the weekend before February 17th was Valentine's Day weekend. And for that reason, Allison and Alex had plans to spend time with one another throughout the weekend. Allison actually got to have breakfast with her mom on the morning of February 14th. At the time, Allison's mom was working as a flight attendant, and she was in town on a brief layover, and so she got to have breakfast with her daughter in Tempe. After Allison had breakfast with her mom that morning, she went home, she did some things around the house, and then she spent time with Alex. For Valentine's Day, Alex made dinner for Allison. He bought her her favorite flowers, which were pink tulips, and a card, and he took her to the movies. And after that, they went back to Allison's home, where they stayed together for the rest of the night. The very next day, February 15th, after a quiet morning at home, Allison and Alex decided to rent bikes. And they did that, and they rode locally through the neighborhoods and the parks, and then they went to Old Town and had lunch together at Zips. After that, they then went back to Allison's house, where they again stayed together for the rest of the night. Now, when Allison wasn't traveling for work, she mainly worked from home. So the next morning, which is Monday the 16th, per her usual routine, she got up and she handled some work matters. Allison was scheduled to go out of town on a brief work trip later that week, and around that same time, Alex was preparing to take his real estate exam. So Allison told Alex, hey, why don't you go home for the next couple days so that you can focus on your studying and I can get ready for my work trip. Allison and Alex didn't have plans to see each other again until Allison got back from her work trip on Friday, February 20th. That afternoon, somewhere between 2 and 3 p.m., Alex left Allison's house to head home. Little did he know that that would be the last time that he would ever see Allison alive. Which brings us to February 17th. Alex believed that Tuesday would be a normal working day for Allison, so he made plans to study all day for his real estate exam at home, which he did. As for Allison, she got up, did her normal thing, work calls, emails, other work-related things that she typically did. And then at lunchtime, she went to a restaurant called the Daily Dose so that she could meet her boss for her annual performance review. Allison was at the Daily Dose until around 2 o'clock that afternoon, and then she made her way home. She spent the rest of the afternoon doing work-related things, and then around 5:20 p.m., she decided to venture out and do some shopping. The first place she went was Kohl's, and she was at that store for just under an hour. After that, she went directly to Walmart, and she went there so she could buy a few groceries and other household items, and she was there for around 20 minutes or so. After she left Walmart, she went home. She got home around 7:15 p.m. A few minutes later, she closed her overhead garage door behind her. She deactivated her alarm, and she settled in for the evening. While she was at home, she put her groceries away, she unpacked some of the items from her Walmart bags, and she turned the TV on. She also exchanged some text messages with Alex, and she exchanged a few texts with one of her coworkers. Unfortunately, those text messages would be the last time that Alex or anyone else ever heard from Allison again. Because later that night, a man unknown to Allison came into her house and proceeded to attack her. From the evidence, we know that Allison was attacked both inside of her home and in her backyard. Other than that, we can't tell you in any great detail exactly what happened to Allison or the order in which it happened. Allison would have been the only person who could have provided you with those details. But what I can tell you is that in her own home, her sanctuary, she was violently beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death. That she suffered multiple blunt force injuries to her head, injuries that caused excessive amounts of bleeding. that so much force was applied to her genitalia that it resulted in multiple lacerations to the inside of her vagina, and that her attacker strangled her, both with his hands and with a ligature, causing her to sustain fractures to the internal structures of her neck. And from the scene, you will see that Allison fought for her life until the point where she simply couldn't fight any longer, and then the only thing left was the bloody aftermath. Displaced furniture, Allison's blood spread throughout her house and the backyard, a broken fingernail on the floor, her earring and a pool tile with a clump of her hair in the swimming pool, and shards of broken glass from beer bottles strewn about the residence. And her killer left with the daunting task of having to eliminate any evidence of having ever been inside her house. After the murder, he searched the kitchen, the laundry room, and the guest bathroom for items that he could find to clean the scene. He wiped and mopped up some of the blood off the floor. He sprayed down door handles and knobs of places that he had touched while he was inside the home. And he poured bleach over the crime scene, including over Allison's body and her dress, to try to eliminate any of his DNA. In fact, Allison's killer spent the next several hours inside her home attempting to eliminate any evidence that could eventually allow the police to connect him to what he had just done. During those several hours, he also looked for small items of value that he could steal. He went into Allison's master bedroom, he rummaged through her dresser drawers and a nightstand, and he went into the garage and he looked through her car parked inside. And when he was finally done, the killer left with some of Allison's jewelry, her wallet, phone, house key, and most importantly, with a large amount of cash. And he simply left Allison's deceased body in an open hallway, naked, with only the black dress that she had been wearing covering her face. Which brings us to February 18th. As I had mentioned to you earlier, Alex had spent most of February 17th, the day before, studying for his real estate exam. And that studying took him into the early morning hours of February 18th. But before he went to bed, he decided to send Allison a goodnight text, recognizing that it was late in the hour and she was likely sleeping. When she didn't respond, he wasn't concerned, and he simply went to bed. Later that morning, when he woke up, he sent her a good morning text, but he received no response. A few hours later, he sent her another text message asking, "Are you okay? I haven't heard from you." And there was still no response. He decided to call her phone, and he called it multiple times right after that last text at 11 in the morning. But all of his calls went unanswered. Now, thinking that Allison might have possibly left early for her business trip and might have been on a plane, Alex decided that he was just going to do a little bit of schoolwork, run a few errands, and then he decided to go meet a friend for a late lunch at Paradise Bakery. When he was done, at around 3:15, he tried to call Allison again. Again, he was unable to reach her. There was no answer. By this time, Alex was concerned. This had been the longest time that he had not heard from Allison ever, and he was surprised that she hadn't gotten back to him. So at this point, he decided to head to her house, and he arrived at her house shortly before 4 p.m. Now, during their relationship, Allison had provided Alex with a code to her garage door, access to her alarm system via an app on his phone, and he had also given her a house key. So when Alex arrived at Allison's house, he parked in the driveway and he made his way to the garage, and he opened the garage door to check and see if her car was inside. He saw that her car was there, so he closed the garage, but before he went to the front door, he went on his phone and looked to see if her alarm was on, and he saw that it wasn't. So he made his way to the front door, but he didn't go in right away. He didn't want to just put his key in and barge in and possibly startle Allison, so he rang the doorbell a few times, but there was still no answer. At that point, he then put his key in and he went inside. Once inside, Alex discovered what appeared to be blood on the floor and displaced furniture, and he smelled an overpowering odor of bleach. And then, to his horror, he found Allison's body naked in the hallway with only something black covering her face. And at that point, he immediately called 911. In response to Alex's call to 911, Scottsdale police personnel and personnel from the fire department were dispatched to Allison's home. The fire department arrived first, and they officially pronounced Allison at 4:10 p.m. Personnel from Scottsdale Police Department also began to arrive, and patrol officers did a walkthrough of the residence to make sure that there was nobody else inside or within the backyard. While walking the residence, one of the things that police noted was that there did not appear to be any obvious signs of forced entry into the home. And another thing that police noted was an odor of bleach so strong that even officers who were standing outside of the house in the street could smell it. Allison's home was then secured until police could obtain a search warrant and begin their investigation. In addition to uniformed officers, homicide detectives, crime scene specialists, and crime scene personnel, or crime lab personnel, I should say, arrived to the home. And for the next 4 days, Scottsdale Police Department forensically processed Allison's home. The individuals responsible for processing the home typically wore booties, gloves, and other protective equipment to try and avoid any contamination of the scene. And at the end of each day, Allison's home was secured and patrol officers were stationed both at the front door of her house as well as in the east alleyway to prevent anyone unauthorized from entering or disturbing the scene. During their investigation of Allison's home, police observed stains throughout the house, both on the walls and on the floor. And these stains were swabbed, and you will hear that these swabs were then taken back to the crime lab for analysis. Police also used a chemical process called Blue Star to identify areas where blood had been deliberately cleaned. Blue Star reacts to both blood and cleaning agents, and this process revealed additional blood that had been cleaned up both inside of the house and in the backyard. Investigators also noted what appeared to be signs of a struggle, both inside and outside of the home. Blood was observed throughout multiple rooms of the house. A piece of Allison's broken fingernail was found on her kitchen floor. Allison's earring was discovered on one of the swimming pool steps, and a broken pool tile with pieces of Allison's hair was located at the bottom of the swimming pool. Also, at the bottom of the pool was a bloodstained doormat. Investigators with the medical examiner's office were then called out to Allison's home to collect her body and transported to their office. Prior to removal, swabs were collected from Allison's body for later analysis. Her body was also inspected, and it was noted that so much bleach was poured over her body that it began to pool in her navel, and it started to make the skin of her body adhere to the tile floor. Once Allison's body was removed by the medical examiner's office, investigators processed the area where it had been found and noted large areas of blood beneath where both her head and genital region had been positioned. Investigators also processed the floors inside the home and outside of the home and preserved footprints, socked footprints, and shoe impressions for possible later comparison. 8 fingerprints and partial latent fingerprints were also collected from several items and surfaces for later possible fingerprint comparison. Police also collected swabs from certain surfaces for later DNA testing. This included swabs from surfaces that the police noted had been sprayed with a possible cleaning solution, such as the faucet, sink, and cabinet doors and handles in the kitchen, the faucet and sink and cabinet doors and handles in the guest bathroom, the cabinet doors and knobs in the laundry room above the washer and dryer, the door handles and knobs on the dresser drawers and nightstand in Allison's bedroom, and the passenger side handle of Allison's car parked in the garage. In their investigation with the assistance of Blue Star, police also observed stains on the living room couch. Cuttings of those stains were then taken and they were collected for later analysis. And then towards the end of the investigation, under Allison's couch, police located the upper portion of a broken beer bottle. Also, smaller pieces of glass consistent with one or more beer bottles were found by investigators on the living room and kitchen floor, as well as in the backyard. In the backyard, police also discovered that Allison had a cooler of beer that they had learned had been there for several weeks when she had a party at her house. And the bottles inside the cooler had rust on the caps from having been soaking in the water inside the cooler for weeks. And on their final day at the scene, police collected numerous items of furniture to include the couch cushions, pillows, coffee table glass tops, the dining room table, sliding doors, her plumbing system, chemicals, anything that they could find that might give them any information that would be useful to their investigation. And like in all cases such as this, an autopsy was performed on Allison in the morning hours of February 19th, 2015, by a forensic pathologist named Dr. Ferentz. After he completed his exam, Dr. Ferentz also asked if he could go out to the scene, and he did so later that afternoon. Dr. Ferentz determined that Allison's cause of death was asphyxia due to compression of the neck and possible compression of the torso. Dr. Ferentz found petechiae, which are small pinpoint dots from broken blood vessels, and other marks that he determined were consistent with strangulation. And he believed, based on what he saw, that Allison was strangled both manually and with a ligature. He also documented multiple blunt force injuries to her body, and the most significant injuries noted were to her head and to her vagina. He determined that she suffered massive blood loss from a large laceration on the rear of her head, and he also located several other smaller lacerations on the back of her head. And then multiple bleeding lacerations, varying in length and depth, were found to her vagina. And then finally, Dr. Ferentz observed bleach-related skin damage that he determined occurred after Allison's death. Now, while certain members of the Scottsdale Police Department processed the scene, additional personnel from Scottsdale Police Department began to investigate Allison's murder in other ways. Given that Alex, her boyfriend, was the one that found her, and given his relationship to her, police decided to interview him first, preliminarily at the scene, and then more thoroughly at the police department. While at the station, Alex voluntarily turned over all of his clothes. He provided a DNA sample to the police. He participated in a forensic physical examination, and he allowed the police to look through his phone. And during these contacts, police noted that Alex did not have any observable injuries and that his body and clothing did not appear to smell like bleach. Investigators also reached out and spoke to Allison's family, initially to notify them of her death, and then a little bit later to try and learn any additional information that might assist them in their investigation. Detectives by this time had already determined that her cell phone, her wallet, her house key, and a charger to the computer that was found on her couch was missing. During those conversations with Allison's family, they learned of additional items missing, such as items of jewelry, a white rug or blanket, I should say, that was typically on the top of her couch, as well as hand towels. Police also canvassed the neighborhood surrounding Allison's home, attempting to talk to every neighbor. And they did this so many times. In the first 6 months, police took 2 days during 3 months to talk to people in the neighborhood. They did it twice in February, they did it twice in March, and they did it twice in September. And still, after they hadn't determined, after 2 years, who had committed this crime, they went out 2 years later and did another canvas event and even expanded the canvas area to try if they could get additional information that might help them solve this case. Additionally, police learned about Allison's security system, and they discovered that there were sensors on her front door, on her sliding glass door, on a laundry room / garage door, and a master bathroom door, and that her system captured all door openings and closings and documented them with a timestamp. And police determined that between 8:42 p.m. on February 17th and approximately 1:04 a.m. the very next day, that Allison's security system documented approximately 20 entries and exits from the residence, which you will hear about in more detail during the trial. Detectives also obtained and viewed an exorbitant amount of surveillance video from places Allison went on February 17th, from cameras affixed to neighbors' homes, and from stores that they were looking at that sold bleach, just to name a few of the types of things that they looked at. Now, early on in the investigation, this also began to be described as a deep dive. They spoke to members of her family, her boss and other coworkers, friends, and an ex-boyfriend. They gathered her phone records, her financial records, her social media and email records. They spoke to people who delivered mail and packages to her residence, not even just the current residence where she was at, but the prior condo where she had lived. They had spoke to people who did work at her house, contractors, the yard guy, the pool guy. Investigators were looking for any information they could find that might help them identify her killer. Police also engaged in a comprehensive investigation into Alex, much beyond their initial interviews with him on February 18th. They looked into his whereabouts on relevant dates and times. They spoke to people who knew him, including past girlfriends. They collected information about him. They obtained his financial records, his phone and email records, his employment and school records. And each time they learned additional information about Alex, they interviewed him again. And this took place for the next 3 years. Other units of the police department were also enlisted to help the Violent Crimes Unit with the investigation. Registered sex offenders in the area were interviewed and surveilled. Known transients were interviewed. Tips from the web were investigated. Phone calls into the Scottsdale Police Department were investigated. And Scottsdale Police even traveled out of state to speak with a man who had committed a murder in somewhat of a similar way, who had ties to Arizona, just to see if he could possibly be involved. Between 2015 and 2018, Scottsdale Police Department spoke to hundreds of people. And one of the tips that police received during the investigation was regarding a man named James Castellamides. You will hear that James lived in relatively the same neighborhood as Allison and had a connection to her because he worked as a pharmacist at a Walgreens where she used to get some of her prescriptions. James is somewhat of an odd guy, and because of that personality and connection to Allison, people in the neighborhood began to gossip about him and the possibility of him being involved in Allison's murder. And so shortly after the murder, police contacted James Castellamides and asked him if he would consent to giving a DNA sample, which he agreed to. They contact James again and question him further about denied any involvement in Allison's murder. He even provided police with another DNA sample. He even agreed to take a polygraph when asked by police. But ultimately, police would exclude him as a suspect in Allison's murder. And while no investigation, ladies and gentlemen, can ever be classified as perfect, for the next 3 years, Scottsdale Police Department conducted an exhaustive investigation to try and identify the person responsible for Allison's murder. And a large part of that investigation involved DNA. You are going to hear a lot about DNA during this trial. As I had mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the investigation, for 4 days, Scottsdale Police Department processed Allison's home for evidence. Part of that processing included testing items of evidence and stains for DNA. Many of those items or swabs came back to individuals you would expect, given that they spent time in the house, such as Allison or Alex. A few of the results even came back to include individuals who were involved in processing the scene. But one of the stains observed, a stain that was located squarely in the middle of the crime scene, stood out to police. Not just the location or the appearance, but also the result. Because unlike most of the other stains that came back as matching Allison or even Alex's DNA, analysis of this stain revealed the DNA profile of an unknown person, and more specifically, an unknown male. And this same DNA profile was not just present on Allison's kitchen floor, but also on a cabinet knob in Allison's laundry room, on the outside handle of Allison's sliding glass door, and on the upper portion of the broken beer bottle that was found under Allison's couch. All areas of the home that would be consistent with areas that Allison's killer would have been, and consistent with items that Allison's killer would have touched. And police believed that once they determined the source of that unknown male profile, that they would learn the identity of Allison's killer. The unknown male's DNA profile derived from PMH, and why it's called PMH is it's photo marker H, so you understand what I'm talking about, was uploaded into a national DNA database called CODIS. And police learned that whoever it belonged to did not have his profile in the system. You will hear a great deal about this stain, PMH, during this trial. You see, throughout the investigation, Scottsdale police collected DNA samples from almost every single male they spoke to, including Allison's boyfriend, Alex, Allison's relatives, friends, neighbors, transients in the area, registered sex offenders in the area, and any other male leads that were investigated. Just under 200 samples were provided to the Scottsdale Police Department's crime lab, and the profiles generated from those samples were compared to the unknown profile derived from PMH to see if there was a match. Not one of the samples that they collected was a match. Therefore, each one of these individuals was excluded by Scottsdale Police Department as a suspect. One of the individuals that was excluded, not once, but twice, was James Castellamidis. And in late 2017, when Scottsdale Police Department had exhausted all investigative leads, they reached out to the Arizona Department of Public Safety's crime lab for assistance, and they requested that a familial DNA search be performed. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, familial DNA searching is a process used to potentially identify close biological relatives of the source of a DNA sample based on statistical comparison. DPS was willing to help Scottsdale, and they performed that search. And the results revealed that the DNA profile recovered from the crime scene likely matched a close male relative of an individual by the name of Mark Mitcham. So from there, detectives worked with a crime analyst to identify male family members of Mark Mitcham and develop intelligence that would assist them with ultimately identifying the source of the DNA recovered from the crime scene. Scottsdale Police Department determined that Mark Mitcham had a brother named Ian Mitcham, and that Ian Mitcham had ties to Scottsdale. The Scottsdale Police Department Crime Lab then compared a known DNA sample of Ian Mitcham to the unknown suspect DNA, which was PMH, recovered from the crime scene, and it was a match. Ian Mitcham, the defendant in this trial, was the source of the unknown DNA profile that Scottsdale Police Department had spent the last 3 years trying to identify. Once police identified the unknown DNA profile as belonging to Ian Mitcham, they began to investigate him further. And during the investigation, police learned that Ian drove a black Ford Mustang. This is going to be important because you will hear that it is a common practice for police officers to run license plates on vehicles that they see driving late at night. And you will learn that in the early morning hours of February 18th of 2015, shortly after Allison's murder, Mitcham's license plate was run by 2 different Scottsdale police officers who observed his Ford Mustang within a few miles of Allison's residence. This fact will become extremely relevant during this trial in relation to the timing of the door activity at Allison's house that morning and other evidence that you will hear. And then finally, on April 10th, 2018, after being linked to the DNA found at the crime scene and to the black Ford Mustang, Ian Mitcham was taken into custody. He agreed to be interviewed by the police, and he sat down and spoke with Detective Heinzelman and Sergeant Lockerbie. During that interview, Mitcham confirmed that he was the only person who was driving the black Mustang back in 2015. He also confirmed that he was living at an address on Pierce Street in Tempe during that same time period. Mitcham told police that back in 2015, he was depressed and that his life sucked. He said he was drinking heavily and frequently, and that it was mainly because he and his former fiancée, a woman by the name of April Hall, were on the outs and headed towards separation. He went on about how April didn't love him, that she didn't want to be with him, and how they were sleeping in separate rooms at this point and no longer having sex. When the subject of Allison's murder was introduced, Mitcham acknowledged that he remembered hearing about her murder and that he had read about it in the news. He further told police that he had heard that Allison had lived off the freeway or Thomas or something like that, and that he remembered her murder being a local story because she was young and it was an unusual thing for Scottsdale. Mitcham was shown a photograph of Allison Feldman and said that he recognized her from the news. When asked if Mitcham knew Allison, he said he didn't know her, he had never met her, and more importantly, that he had never been to her house. Mitcham was also shown a picture of Allison's boyfriend, Alex, and he also denied any connection or knowledge of Alex or that he knew him or had ever met him. Ultimately, Mitcham denied any involvement in Allison's murder. But what will be important from his interview with the police is not only the information he provided, but the information that he didn't. Because even though the police had located his DNA on multiple items and surfaces in Allison's home, Mitcham maintained that he had never been inside of Allison's house, and he was unable to provide any explanation for how his DNA ended up in this crime scene. As part of the investigation, Scottsdale Police Department also executed search warrants at the address where Mitcham was living in 2018, which was a different address than where he was living in 2015. And they also executed a search warrant on his black Ford Mustang. Given that these warrants were executed 3 years after Allison's murder, and Mitcham had this entire time to dispose of anything that could tie him to the murder, it was no surprise that nothing of evidentiary value was located. Even after the police arrested Mitcham, they continued to investigate him further. And one of the ways they did this was by obtaining his banking records to see if there was any unusual activity at or near the time of Allison's murder. And what police discovered when reviewing those records was that Mitcham appeared to be struggling financially back in 2015, that his primary bank account was routinely overdrawn, he was constantly getting hit with overdraft fees, and that this was happening in the weeks and days leading up to the murder. But of greatest significance to the police in those records were 2 large ATM deposits, as you can see in green, made by Mitcham, and the locations, dates, and times those deposits were made in relation to Allison's murder. On February 18th, 2015, at around 12:28 a.m., Mitcham deposited $1,000 into an ATM located just a few miles from Allison's home. And then later that same day, he made another deposit of $1,500 into an ATM located near his work. You will see and hear testimony that over the course of a calendar year, that Mitcham had never made deposits in cash of this size, and that any sizable deposits into this account were from his employer. You will learn the significance of the deposit at 12:28 a.m. on February 18th and how it coincides with the door activity at Allison's home and the times that Mitcham's license plate was run by the 2 Scottsdale officers. As part of the investigation, police also interviewed April Hull on April 10th, 2018, Mitcham's former fiance and mother of his child. During that interview, April confirmed that Mitcham was driving the black Mustang and that he lived with her at that Pierce address back in 2015. Police also learned that April had been keeping a journal on her cell phone with entries dating all the way back to 2012. And from this journal, they noted that April had documented that on February 17th, 2015, that Mitcham was not home that night, and that she remembered going to bed at around 11 p.m. and Mitcham had never come home that day. April further documented in her journal that when she woke up the next day, Mitcham was home, and then mentioned that after he dropped off their daughter at school, she didn't see him again until 8 p.m. that night. April described Mitcham as being secretive and that he was constantly hiding things and that she didn't have access to the areas where he did so. And she told police that it wasn't unusual for Mitcham to come home looking disheveled or even scratched up at times, though she didn't recall anything that stood out to her when she saw him on April 18th of 2015. When police asked April about her sexual relationship with Mitcham, they learned that Mitcham had engaged in strangulation with her during prior sexual encounters, and that on at least one occasion have left marks on her neck from the strangulation. As part of their investigation, police also talked to another one of Mitcham's former girlfriends, where they learned that Mitcham had engaged in strangulation with her multiple times during sex, and that the strangulation had involved both Mitcham using his hands and on one occasion, Mitcham using a belt, and that on one occasion resulting in a mark being left on her neck. As part of the police investigation, Mitcham's phone was also collected, and of interest to the police was a specific pornographic video located in his phone that depicted an act of strangulation, not only similar to the acts described by Mitcham's former girlfriends, but similar to the mechanism of injury described and determined in the homicide, thus illustrating Mitcham's propensity and sexual interest for asphyxiation. Police also spoke to various family members that the defendant was living with at the time of his arrest, all of which claimed to know nothing about the defendant's involvement in these crimes. To date, police have never been able to establish any other reason for the defendant's presence in Allison's home other than the fact that he was the person responsible for her attack. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here because on February 17th, 2015, the defendant, Ian Mitcham, inflicted unimaginable violence upon Allison Feldman, an innocent and unsuspecting victim, a person who he didn't even know, a person who he had no connection to, a person who did not deserve to die in the manner in which she did or in the place where she was supposed to feel the safest. Before that night, Allison's home, her sanctuary, was a place of security, peace, and comfort. It should not have been the place where her young and promising life came to an end. The time has now come, nearly 11 years after Allison's brutal attack, for the defendant to face the consequences of the actions he took and the decisions he made on February 17th, 2015. Because his actions and his decisions are what have earned him a seat in this courtroom. And the state is confident that after you listen to and evaluate all the evidence in this case, that you will find no other appropriate verdict to return for the crimes that he is charged with, but guilty.
And at this time, I'll turn it over to the defense whenever you're ready.
Judge.
And did you want to approach?
Yeah.
Sure. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we're just, given the time that we're at past 11:34, what we're gonna do is take our lunch break now and we'll come back at 1 o'clock. Please remember that admonition that we discussed last week. Please do not discuss the case with one another or look up the case or call or text anyone about the case. And we will see you back here at 1 p.m. Have a nice lunch. Thank you.
Please rise for the jury.
Please be seated. Let the record reflect we are outside the presence of the jury. Anything to take up before we adjourn for lunch? Anything from the state?
Actually, can we just approach on something really quick?
Sure.